The third body in 48 hours lay sprawled across the intersection of 5th and Madison, blood pooling in the cracks of Detroit's neglected asphalt. David Sloan stood at the police tape perimeter, his weathered face illuminated by the alternating red and blue of squad car lights. At 53, he'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but something about this latest killing made his skin crawl in a way that 2 decades on the force hadn't managed to dull. The victim was Marcus Chen, a pediatric nurse with no criminal record, no enemies, no connection to the previous 2 victims that anyone could find. Just like the others, he'd been beaten to death with whatever was at hand. In this case, a piece of rebar pulled from a nearby construction site. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, washing pink rivulets toward the storm drains. David pulled his collar up, watching as the forensics team scrambled to preserve what evidence they could. Detroit, in 2032, wasn't the city he'd sworn to protect 23 years ago. The economic collapse of 2029 had gutted what remained of the middle class, leaving behind a hollowed-out urban wasteland where those who couldn't afford to leave scraped by in the shadows of abandoned automotive plants and foreclosed dreams. The police force itself was down to 60% capacity, overwhelmed and underfunded, operating more like an occupying army than a service meant to protect and serve. "Sir, we've got another one!" Officer Martinez called out, his young face pale in the streetlight. Corktown, female, mid-30s, same M.O., beaten with found objects, no witnesses, no cameras that work. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. His phone buzzed, a text from his ex-wife Lauren about their son Jake missing another court-mandated therapy session, another failure to add to his growing collection. He pocketed the phone without responding and headed toward his unmarked Crown Victoria, one of the last functioning vehicles in the department's aging fleet. The drive to Corktown took him through neighborhoods that looked like war zones, burned-out buildings, makeshift homeless encampments, streets where even the streetlights had been stripped for copper. The city's new reality was one where civilization's veneer had worn so thin you could see the chaos underneath, waiting to break through. The fourth victim was Sarah Hendricks, a social worker who dedicated her life to helping Detroit's forgotten children. She'd been killed with a broken bottle and a chunk of concrete, her body left in an alley behind the community center where she'd worked. Elena Torres was already at the scene when David arrived, her sharp eyes scanning the area with the intensity of someone who took every crime personally. At 35, Elena was brilliant, driven, and carrying wounds that hadn't begun to heal. Her younger brother Miguel had been killed 6 months ago in what the department had classified as a random mugging, though Elena had never accepted that explanation. She'd thrown herself into work with the kind of desperate energy that David recognized, the need to find meaning in senselessness, to impose order on chaos. 4 in 2 days, Elena said without preamble, her voice tight with frustration. No pattern in victimology. Chen was Asian, worked north side. Williams was black, unemployed, lived in a shelter. Morrison was white, middle management at what's left of Ford. Now Hendricks, different ages, races, economic backgrounds, neighborhoods. The only thing they have in common is that they're dead. David crouched beside the body, noting the savage nature of the attack. This wasn't just murder, it was rage given physical form. But rage at what? The victim seemed chosen at random, as if someone had spun a wheel, and wherever it landed, death followed. Any witnesses? Woman in the apartment above heard screaming around 2 a.m., but she was too scared to look out her window. Can't blame her. This neighborhood, you keep your head down and hope the violence passes you by. They processed the scene methodically, but David could feel the futility of it. In a city where half the surveillance cameras had been sold for scrap and the crime lab was 6 months behind on DNA processing, solving random murders was like trying to hold water in your hands. The rain intensified, drumming on the aluminum awning above them, washing away whatever forensic evidence might have remained. Back at the precinct, a building that hadn't seen renovation since the 1990s, David and Elena spread out the case files across a conference table held together with duct tape. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows that made reading difficult. Captain Reynolds, a man who'd aged a decade in the last 3 years, stuck his head in the door. "Mayor's office is breathing down my neck," he said, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. "4 bodies and we've got nothing? They're talking about calling in the National Guard if this continues." "The Guard won't help," David replied. "This isn't a riot or organized crime. It's something else. These killings are purposeful but without purpose, if that makes sense. Someone's choosing to kill, but the choice of victim seems completely random." Reynolds left them with a warning about having something concrete by morning. Elena pulled up the city's crime statistics on her tablet, one of the few pieces of functioning technology they had access to. "Look at this. Violent crime is up 300% since 2029. But it's mostly predictable. Drug territory disputes, domestic violence amplified by economic stress, robbery gone wrong. This is different." David's phone rang. Jake calling. He almost didn't answer, but something in him, some remnant of paternal instinct, made him pick up. "Dad? I'm scared. There was another killing near school. Mom wants to leave the city, but she can't afford to move. Can you come over?" The vulnerability in his 17-year-old son's voice cut through David's professional detachment. "I'm working the case, Jake. We're going to find who's doing this." "How can you find them when there's no reason?" "My friend's dad, he's a professor. He says it's societal collapse, that when systems fail, violence becomes random, like entropy or something." David wanted to argue, to reassure his son that there was always a pattern, always a logic to even the most senseless crimes. But standing in that decaying precinct, looking at 4 faces of the dead who had nothing in common except their mortality, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The 5th and 6th bodies were discovered simultaneously at dawn, one in Lafayette Park and another at the abandoned Michigan Central Station. David had been awake for 36 hours straight, sustained by coffee that tasted like battery acid and a grim determination that was eroding with each passing hour. The Lafayette Park victim was a homeless veteran named Tom Bradley. The station victim was Jennifer Wu, a real estate developer who'd been trying to revitalize parts of downtown. No connection, no motive, no reason, just chaos spreading like a virus through the city's veins. Elena met him at the station, the massive hulk of the once grand building looming behind them like a monument to Detroit's fallen glory. The morning sun cast long shadows through the broken windows, creating patterns on the debris-strewn floor where Jennifer Wu's body lay. She'd been killed with a piece of rusted track rail, the violence so extreme it suggested not just murder, but annihilation. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "What if we're looking at this wrong? What if the randomness is the point?" David looked up from his notes. "Explain." "Every system of law enforcement, every investigative technique we have is based on the assumption that crimes have logic, motive, opportunity, means. We look for patterns because humans are pattern-making creatures. But what if someone is deliberately creating patternless violence? What if the chaos itself is the goal?" It was a terrifying thought, one that challenged everything David had built his career on. He'd always believed that beneath even the most senseless violence was a comprehensible human motivation: greed, jealousy, fear, rage. But pure chaos? Violence for the sake of destroying the very concept of cause and effect? They were interrupted by David's phone. Captain Reynolds, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We've got 3 more bodies, David. The mayor's declaring a state of emergency, and there's something else. City Council member Robert Sterling is missing. His security detail found blood at his home, but no body." Sterling was one of the few politicians who'd been pushing for police reform and increased funding for mental health services. His disappearance would send shockwaves through what remained of Detroit's power structure. David and Elena rushed to Sterling's house in Indian Village, one of the last neighborhoods where the wealthy still maintained their enclaves behind high walls and private security. The scene was different from the others, less chaotic, more controlled. Blood spatter on the walls suggested violence, but there was no body, no immediate evidence of the frenzied beating that characterized the other murders. Elena examined the pattern of blood on the walls, her analytical mind working through possibilities. "This is staged," she said. "The spatter pattern doesn't match actual violence. Someone wanted us to think Sterling was attacked here, but he wasn't. This is theater." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Sterling's disappearance was connected to the random killings, it suggested a level of planning that contradicted the apparent chaos. Unless the chaos was just camouflage for something more targeted, more purposeful. They spent the day interviewing Sterling's staff, his family, anyone who might have seen or heard something, but it was like trying to grab smoke. Everyone was scared, paranoid, looking over their shoulders. The city's social fabric, already threadbare, was tearing completely. Gun sales had tripled in the last 48 hours. Neighborhood watch groups were forming, armed and angry. The ingredients for complete urban breakdown were all present. It just needed a spark. That evening, David finally went to see Jake and Lauren. His ex-wife's apartment in Midtown was small but clean, a desperate attempt at normalcy in a city going mad. Jake hugged him for the first time in 2 years, fear overcoming teenage resentment. Lauren looked older, grayer, the stress of single parenthood in a dying city etched into every line of her face. "You need to get them out," David told her quietly while Jake was in his room. "Take him to your sister's in Chicago. Tonight, if possible." "With what money, David? You think I haven't thought about leaving? Everyone who can afford to leave already has. We're the ones left behind, the ones without options." It was true. Detroit's population had dropped below 400,000, the lowest since the 1890s. Those who remained were either too poor to leave, too stubborn to quit, or profiting from the chaos. David gave her what cash he had, $300 that wouldn't get them far, but might buy bus tickets. His phone buzzed. "Elena. Sterling's body found. You need to see this." The location was the old Packard plant, a massive automotive factory that had been abandoned for decades. Sterling's body was positioned in what had once been the executive offices, seated behind a rusted desk as if conducting a meeting. But it was what surrounded him that made David's blood run cold. Photographs of all the victims, including ones who hadn't been found yet, arranged on the walls like a grotesque gallery. "Jesus Christ," Elena breathed. "There are 12 more photos of people who aren't dead yet. This isn't random. Someone's been planning this." David studied the photos, looking for connections his exhausted mind might have missed. Then he saw it. Barely visible in the corner of each photo was a timestamp and a location tag. They were all taken from city surveillance cameras, the few that still worked. Someone with access to the city's security system had been selecting victims, watching them, choosing their moments. "We need to check who has access to the surveillance network," David said. Elena was already pulling up records on her tablet. After the budget cuts, the city outsourced surveillance to a private company, Prometheus Security Solutions. They're owned by a shell company that traces back to Robert Sterling. The implications were staggering. Sterling had been using his position to select victims, orchestrate chaos, but why? What could he possibly gain from random violence that terrorized the city he claimed to serve? David's phone rang again. An unknown number. He answered, and Sterling's voice, very much alive, came through clear and calm. "Detective Sloan, by now you've found my theatrical corpse and started to piece things together. Good. I was beginning to worry the city's finest had lost all capacity for deductive reasoning." David put the phone on speaker, gesturing for Elena to start recording. Sterling's voice filled the abandoned office, echoing off rusted machinery and broken windows. The sound was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing municipal budgets rather than mass murder. "You're wondering why," Sterling continued. "Everyone always wants to know why, as if understanding motive somehow makes violence comprehensible, acceptable even. But what if there is no why? What if chaos doesn't need a reason?" "There's always a reason," David said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Even if it's just that you're a psychopath who gets off on watching people suffer." Sterling laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Such a limited imagination, detective. I'm not a psychopath, I'm a realist. This city, this entire system, is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable collapse, helping people see what's been in front of them all along." Elena grabbed the phone. "You killed innocent people. Marcus Chen had 2 kids. Sarah Hendricks spent her life helping others. What did they do to deserve death?" "Deserve? You still think in terms of deserving, of justice, of meaning. That's your weakness, Investigator Torres. Your brother didn't deserve to die either, did he? But he did. Random violence took him, just like it's taking others now. The only difference is I'm showing you that the randomness you fear is already here. I'm just making it visible." The connection cut off. David immediately called dispatch to trace the call, but he knew it would be futile. Sterling was too smart, too connected. He'd been planning this for who knew how long, using his position on the city council to access resources, information, and most importantly, the surveillance system that let him play God with people's lives. They worked through the night, pulling Sterling's financial records, his communications, anything that might give them a clue to his location or his next move. Elena discovered that Sterling had been buying properties throughout Detroit for years. Abandoned buildings, foreclosed homes, places where someone could hide indefinitely in a city that had more ruins than a war zone. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to her screen. 3 months ago, Sterling proposed a new emergency response system to the city council. It would have given him direct control over police deployment, emergency services, essentially the entire city's crisis management infrastructure. The proposal was rejected. David studied the document. He wanted to control the city's response to chaos, and when they said no, he decided to create the chaos himself, force them to give him what he wanted. "Or prove that the city is beyond saving," Elena added. "Either way, he wins." The photographs of future victims haunted David. 12 people who were going to die if they couldn't stop Sterling. He recognized some faces, a teacher from Jake's school, a nurse from the hospital where Lauren worked, ordinary people whose only crime was being caught in Sterling's digital web. They tried calling them, warning them, but how do you tell someone they've been marked for death by a madman with access to every camera in the city? Most didn't believe them. Those who did had nowhere to go. Dawn broke grey and lifeless over Detroit, the sky matching the city's mood. David hadn't slept in 2 days, and the exhaustion was affecting his judgment. He found himself standing on the roof of the precinct, looking out over the dying city, wondering if Sterling was right. Maybe Detroit was already dead. Maybe they were all just ghosts refusing to acknowledge their own demise. Eleanor found him there, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "My brother used to come up here when he was a cop," she said. "Said it helped him remember why the job mattered, seeing the whole city spread out like this." "What do you see when you look out there?" David asked. "Honestly, I see fear. Every window, every street, every person just trying to survive another day. But I also see resilience. People who refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier." She paused, sipping her coffee. "Sterling thinks chaos is truth, but he's wrong. Chaos is just chaos. What matters is how we respond to it." David's phone buzzed. "Jake, Dad, Mr. Petrov didn't show up for class. He's the one in the photo, isn't he?" Petrov, the teacher from Jake's school. David's blood ran cold. He called Jake immediately. "Where are you?" "At school. They haven't cancelled classes yet. Dad, I'm scared." "Get your mother and get out now. Go to the bus station. I'll meet you there." But even as he said it, David knew it was too late. The morning news was already reporting 2 more bodies found, a teacher and a nurse, exactly as Sterling had promised. The city was spiraling into panic. The National Guard was being deployed, but they were weekend warriors unprepared for urban pacification. The mayor was considering a full evacuation of the downtown core. David and Elena raced to the school, but Petrov was already dead, his body discovered in the parking lot by arriving students. The scene was chaos, screaming teenagers, overwhelmed teachers, parents arriving in panic to pull their children out. David found Jake in the crowd, grabbed him, held him tight. "We're leaving," Jake said against his shoulder. "Mom's packing now. She said to tell you, she said to be careful." David wanted to go with them, to abandon this doomed city and his futile investigation. But he couldn't, not while Sterling was still out there, not while more names were on that list. He watched Jake get into Lauren's beat-up Honda, watched them drive away, and felt a piece of himself leave with them. "He's accelerating," Elena said, checking her phone. 3 more bodies just reported. He's not waiting anymore. They were losing. Sterling was always one step ahead, always watching through his network of cameras, always knowing where they were and what they were doing. The city was eating itself alive, and they were powerless to stop it. Then Eleanor had an idea. The cameras work both ways. If he's watching through them, he has to be connected to them. And if he's connected, we can trace the connection back to him, David finished. But we'd need someone who understands the system. "I know someone," Elena said. "My brother's partner before he died, Marcus Washington. He works in IT now, private sector, but he still has contacts. If anyone can track Sterling through his own surveillance network, it's him." Marcus Washington operated out of a fortified warehouse in Eastern Market, one of the few neighborhoods where community organization had prevented complete collapse. The building was surrounded by armed locals who recognized Elena and let them pass, though their expressions made it clear that cops, even desperate ones, weren't particularly welcome. Marcus himself was a large man with sad eyes and hands that moved constantly, a nervous energy that David recognized as grief transformed into motion. "Elena told me about Sterling," Marcus said, leading them through a maze of servers and computer equipment that probably cost more than the entire police department's annual technology budget. "Using the surveillance system to hunt people, it's sick, but it's also traceable. Every connection leaves a signature, a digital fingerprint. If he's accessing multiple cameras simultaneously to track victims, I can follow that trail back to its source." While Marcus worked, David and Elena coordinated with what remained of the police force to protect the remaining people on Sterling's list. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with their hands. The city had 12,000 officers in the 1990s. Now they had fewer than 800 for a city that sprawled over 140 square miles. The National Guard had set up checkpoints, but they were focused on preventing riots, not stopping a single intelligent killer with infrastructure access. Elena's phone rang. Sterling again, this time on her personal cell. She put it on speaker. "Investigator Torres, I wanted to thank you. Your brother's death was what opened my eyes to the truth. A good cop, killed randomly, no reason, no justice. That's when I understood. Chaos isn't the exception, it's the rule. Order is the illusion we create to make life bearable." Elena's face went pale, then flushed with rage. "You knew my brother. I was there when he died, not participating, just observing, watching how a random encounter, wrong place, wrong time, could end a life full of purpose and meaning. It was educational. It taught me that meaning is something we impose after the fact, not something inherent in events." David grabbed the phone before Eleanor could respond. "Philosophy doesn't justify murder, Sterling. Doesn't it? Every system of law, every concept of justice is just philosophy with enforcement mechanisms. I'm simply demonstrating a different philosophy, one where chaos reveals truth rather than obscuring it." Marcus suddenly looked up from his screens, gesturing frantically. He'd found something. David kept Sterling talking while Marcus traced the connection. If chaos is truth, why the planning? Why the list? That seems pretty ordered to me. Sterling paused, perhaps recognizing the trap. Even chaos needs a catalyst, detective. I'm not creating chaos. I'm revealing it, showing this city what it really is beneath the pretense of civilization. Marcus scribbled an address on a piece of paper. An abandoned apartment complex in Brush Park, one of Sterling's properties. David and Elena exchanged glances. They had him, but Sterling wasn't finished. I know you're tracing this call. I'm not stupid, detective. By all means, come find me. But know that when you do, you'll have to make a choice. I've rigged the building with enough explosives to level a city block. I also have 3 of the people from my list here with me, still alive. You can try to save them, or you can stop me. You can't do both. The call ended. David immediately called for bomb squad and backup, but he knew they wouldn't wait. 3 lives hung in the balance, and Sterling was escalating towards some final catastrophic statement. The apartment complex was a 7-story ruin, windows boarded or broken, walls covered with graffiti that looked like prophecies of doom. They could see lights on the top floor. Sterling's invitation. Elena had grabbed tactical gear from the warehouse, and Marcus insisted on coming, saying his brother would never forgive him if he let Eleanor face this alone. They entered through a side door, the darkness inside absolute except for their flashlights. The building smelled of decay and human desperation, the floors littered with needles and worse. Somewhere above them, Sterling waited with his hostages and his philosophy of chaos. On the 3rd floor, they found the first victim, a social worker named Patricia Kim, tied up but alive, a timer attached to what looked like improvised explosives. Marcus immediately went to work on the device while David and Elena continued up. The 4th floor had another hostage, the 5th floor another, each with their own timer, each counting down from different intervals. Sterling was forcing them to split up, to choose who to save. David reached the 7th floor alone, Eleanor having stayed to help with the 2nd hostage. Sterling stood by the windows, the city spread out below him like a patient on an operating table. He was smaller than David had expected, unremarkable except for his eyes, which held a terrible clarity. "You see it, don't you?" Sterling said, not turning around. "The city dying, order collapsing into entropy. I'm just the messenger, detective. The truth was always there." "You're not a messenger," David said, his gun trained on Sterling. "You're a killer who's trying to justify his sickness with pseudo-philosophical bullshit." Sterling finally turned, and David saw he was holding a dead man's switch. If he let go, everything would blow. Perhaps. "But answer me this, when you look at those bodies, those random victims, don't you feel it? The meaninglessness? Your entire career has been about finding patterns, motives, reasons. But what if there are none? What if Miguel Torres died for nothing, just like Marcus Chen and Sarah Hendricks and all the others? They didn't die for nothing." Eleanor's voice came from the stairwell. She'd left the hostage, choosing confrontation over rescue. "They died because you killed them. That's not chaos, that's choice. Your choice." Sterling smiled sadly. "And now you have a choice. Shoot me, and everyone in this building dies. Let me go, and the killing continues. Or," he pulled out a gun with his free hand, "you let me show you the ultimate truth about chaos." He put the gun to his own head. "Don't!" David shouted, but Sterling just smiled. "Chaos doesn't need a reason," he said, and pulled the trigger. The dead man's switch fell from his lifeless hand. David and Elena had exactly 3 seconds to realize they were going to die before Marcus's voice crackled over their radio. "Devices disarmed. They were fakes. The explosives are fake." Sterling had lied, even about his final act of chaos. The building didn't explode. The hostages were rescued. The killing stopped. But as David stood over Sterling's body, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man had won something, had proven some point that David didn't want to understand. The city didn't miraculously recover. The National Guard maintained order for 3 weeks before pulling out. The murder rate remained astronomical. People continued to leave, those who could afford to. But there were also those who stayed, who rebuilt, who refused to let chaos be the final word. David retired a month later, following Jake and Lauren to Chicago. Elena took over the investigation unit, approaching each new case with the knowledge that sometimes there were no answers, only choices about how to respond to senselessness. She kept a photo of her brother on her desk, next to one of the victims they'd saved from Sterling's building, proof that even in chaos, individual actions mattered. The official report classified Sterling's motivation as delusional nihilism brought on by psychological break. But David knew it was both simpler and more complex than that. Sterling had looked into the abyss of urban collapse and decided to become the abyss. He'd chosen chaos because order had failed him, or because he'd failed at order. Standing in his new apartment in Chicago, watching Jake do homework at the kitchen table, David thought about Sterling's last words. Chaos didn't need a reason, but neither did the choice to oppose it, to build meaning in its despite. That choice, repeated daily by millions of people in thousands of dying cities, was perhaps the only answer to entropy that humanity had ever found. Detroit continued its slow transformation, neither dying nor thriving, but persisting. The chaos Sterling had unleashed gradually faded into the background radiation of urban decay, indistinguishable from all the other violence that plagued forgotten cities. But for those who'd lived through those terrible weeks, who'd seen how quickly order could collapse into murderous randomness, nothing would ever feel quite solid again. The thin line between civilization and chaos had been revealed, and once seen, it could never be completely unseen. In the end, Sterling had been wrong about one thing. Chaos wasn't truth. It was just chaos. The truth was in how people responded to it, in the choices they made when faced with senselessness. Some, like Sterling, chose to embrace the void. Others, like David and Elena, chose to build meaning even on foundations of sand. Neither choice was inevitable. Both were profoundly, inescapably human.